I'm here to introduce two members of our pro services team, two really great guys, Doug and Steve, and I'll let them kick it off and introduce themselves a little bit more.
Thanks, Kyle. Doug Worley, professional services engineer out of California. And when we say services at this company, that means that my office is your office, showing up at customer locations to help out with what you guys need to accomplish. And by doing that, I've seen a number of different ways in which a scaled deployment of our product has worked. The title that you saw on the schedule was the Art of Scaling, the JSS, and as you heard earlier today, we've now changed all the logos, but it's new for all of us. If I might have to put a couple dollars in the jar myself, so please forgive if that happens. And Steve, introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. I'm Steve Welgoss, and I'm Doug's much older and less good-looking counterpart on the East Coast. It's great that we've bookended the two coasts that way. Yeah, you can stay a little farther on the left coast, and I'll be on the right now. Anyhow, it's wonderful to see you all today. Do you want to click to the next guy? Okay. So there you can see different pictures of us. As Doug mentioned, he's on the West Coast. Doug's been with Jamf for about 4 years now, right?
Yeah.
And I've been with Jamf almost 6 years. So together, we've had a number of years' experience now with folks such as yourself with this exact subject matter, which is the decision-making of when and how to scale a Jamf server. So with that, we can get right into it. Doug?
So last year, we heard some big announcements about some very large deployments. Tomorrow, you'll hear some more about a couple of those large deployments. I see some heads nodding. You know what I'm talking around. We can't speak to any specifics with any one project, but there's some generalities, and we'll walk you through the thoughts and the questions we ask our customers when coming to design these things. First off, be sure we're all on the same page on vocabulary. There was a three-letter acronym on the slide last week, and it was still called the JSS. It's $1. But now we're calling it the Jamf Pro Server. So that's the same thing as we're used to. That could mean a couple different things. That could mean either the web application. That could mean the server running Tomcat with the web application, or it might mean the collection of servers all together providing Jamf Pro. And we'll use the same terms interchangeably, kind of as a mixed bag. Secondly, there's the idea of the managed client. We're all familiar with that. That comes down to the agent on the local machine, inventory record about the machine, the certificate pairing between them, and a valid network route to make the connection. Speaking of network directions, it's always in one direction. It's from the device to Jamf Pro. It's from Jamf Pro out to Apple or Jamf Cloud or that sort of thing. And finally, there's the idea of a cluster, where we have multiple web applications talking to a shared database. And with that foundation, we can then move into some more interesting concepts and questions and discussions. First off, when you do your jump start, you may have had a very humble start. You may have had, installing a JSS on a Mac Mini. We do that regularly, and it works fine for many beginning deployments. But that's not going to scale very large. You're going to reach the maximum of what the total amount of devices each Mac Mini could support. So we can then run it on various flavors of Linux. Red Hat is my personal preference. But it also works out so that we can deploy it on Windows. It's funny. I've been working in Mac IT for about 12 years, and I've never touched so many Windows machines until I worked for Jamf. Sign of the times.
Okay, so what we're looking at here is a very basic setup, probably what maybe most of you ended up with after your jump start. So we thought we'd start with this just so we can, talk about some of the components that make up a Jamf server. So in this diagram, we can see all of our services are being hosted on the same server. The components that make up the Jamf server are, of course, our MySQL database. We're currently recommending supporting 5.5 and 5.6. Obviously, we are also going to be considering our JDK and JCE currently supporting versions 7 and 8. That's an important thing just to note here, because if any of you are considering your scaling or upgrading, some of you may be at earlier versions, and it's important to note that moving forward, Java 6 is not supported. And then, of course, we support Tomcat 7 and 8, and if you're using the JSS installer now, the current JSS automatically will lay down our version of Tomcat 8 for you. In this diagram, you're going to also see that we're including the file share distribution point on this as part of the same server. Now, in this presentation today, we're really not going to get into file share distribution points, because that can be its own dedicated conversation. So you'll see some references to it just so we keep that in our mind, but it's not our intention today to talk about scaling distribution points. Excuse me. But that is something to consider here. So as Doug mentioned, when we're talking about port direction and communications, we can see in this diagram where our client devices are communicating directly to our server. And then we can see our server is going to be communicating with Jamf Cloud over 443. It's important now for us to really be considering that in our regular planning now, because as we talk about the advent of patch, our Jamf server, I almost said JSS, but I didn't. I still got to put $1 in the jar. Our Jamf server does need to now be communicating with the patch service regularly, as well as our APNS communications. So as we take a vantage point here, looking forward to a scaled JSS from our initial all-in-one, if you will, we have our considerations now. So the things that really point us towards considering scaling are number of clients. Maybe you're going to be considering how many clients you're going to be managing for planning. But there's also additional considerations for us here as well. And really what we can see here is we need to determine how much work is going to be done. What are we doing with the JSS? If you ask your Jamf buddy or anyone else a question, well, how many servers should I be running? How many web apps are running? And you're going to get that very specific answer, well, it depends. And not only does it depend on the clients that you're going to be managing, but also what work is being done. So as we can see in the diagram here, we're looking at a JSS that is not terribly populated for policies versus 165 policies. So, some considerations that we want to think about in terms of how to scale and how much to scale. We're going to be thinking about how many policies and configuration profiles that we're currently managing, how we've set up our reoccurring check-in versus whether we have more of a self-service culture, and just the amount of actions that we're taking. So obviously the more work, the more things that our JSS are, oh, that was a genuine $1 in the bucket, the more that we're expecting from our Jamf server, obviously the more resources that we're going to need to provide. So the last item here is very important to realize is the number of devices that you're managing is an important metric, but is really only one consideration.
And that brings us to a few other questions to ask ourselves and our customers. Namely, when you start wanting to actually do the scaling, how do we actually do that? What are the nuts and bolts in there? This partially comes back to the discussion on the core OS. Are you choosing headless Linux? In that case, the hardware requirements might be a little less. That might be predicated on the support model. Does your team have access to people that actually know Linux? Can they do the patching? Can they do the support? Do they understand the differences between how different packages install on different versions of Linux? Or are you a Windows shop, and do we need to do everything on ARP 2012? Those are going to increase, because if you're running a GUI, obviously that's going to take its own overhead. It's going to eat into the resources, the CPUs, the RAM that you have available in your hypervisor. Once you move past that, we have two basic methodologies we can use to scale. One is the idea of scaling vertically, where we have a server, and we add more CPU, we add more RAM to it. We then have to go into the configuration files for Java, like the setenv.sh script, the various qualities to tell MySQL, here's your max utilization pool that can take up your minimum memory, maximum memory pools, and Tomcat and all of that. If you're adding more CPU and RAM, you need to tell the software how to use that. That comes down to how familiar is your team supporting Tomcat on Linux, Tomcat on Windows. It all depends on what your support model is that tells you whether scaling vertically is the right choice Or do you want to just add another stock VM and just have Tomcat with its base configuration right out of the box and just add another couple, 3 servers into the pool? It all depends, right? I've seen some customers that have done both. They've added a number of servers. They've scaled them vertically, so they've got a mixed model. Other teams, like, we don't have time to worry about that. Just throw another VM in the cluster, tweak the load balancer so that it knows about them, and move on. Right? Neither of those are better than the other. It just comes down to the support model and how comfortable your team is with the various qualities inside. And that brings us to the first kind of scaling we can do. If we're on a single server setup, like single Mac Mini, that tends to not provide access to clients outside of your network. So you might need to add another JSS into your demilitarized zone, DMZ, DMZ, depending upon what vocabulary we use across the globe. So we see how the internal Jamf Pro server is effectively the same exact thing as we saw in the single server setup. It's got database, it's got Java, it's got Tomcat. It's got your file share point split off a little bit, because now we're starting to have a little discussion about that. And this is the last time we'll see it, but we're just tossing it because it's something else to think about. It's separated out somehow. But we now have the beginnings of a cluster. We have a separated Tomcat server in your outside-facing network that has a secured tunnel for the database to connect in. So the database now has to be aware of 2 different Tomcat servers, and that right there starts to change the diagram just a little bit. Things to keep in mind there. Each Tomcat server has to have its own route out to Apple, own route out to Jamf Cloud, everything. So it's not like you can make your changes on one and expect the other server to just magically have the route out.
Okay, our next slide is now a basic load balance setup. So the fundamental concept here is now we're going to want to have, regardless of where it lives in terms of your network, we're going to have more than one Jamf Pro server being available for client services. So, some driving forces behind this is we're talking about scaling the setup for load, or it may be in your environment's requirement that you have just simply high availability. So in this situation, we're now setting up 2 instances of a Jamf Pro server living behind a load balancer. And we can also see that we've now broken off a function here. We now have a separate server running MySQL. And so our 2 Jamf Pro servers, which are obviously, as far as components, are running Java and Tomcat, as well as the web app, are communicating directly with this instance of MySQL. So another item that we're going to have to make sure that we do when we set up our database or move our database over, we're going to need to have another grant created for our second web app. And now these 2 web apps here, we're going to need to configure also using the clustering functionality within the admin console. And another consideration is now it's going to be behind a load balancer. So this opens up a great deal of dialogue now for you to consider within your own individual environment, such as who's going to configure the load balancer. Do you have your own internal architecture requirements within your organization and security requirements in your organization? Because we've got a lot of questions that we're going to have answers for. So obviously our client devices are going to be terminating at being pointed at the JSS URL, which is going to terminate at the load balancer. So we've got questions of, are we going to be terminating our SSL at the load balancer, and then what becomes of that traffic? Right? So in this diagram, we can see that we're having a secure communication to the load balancer, and then the communication between the load balancer and our Jamf Pro servers might be secure over 8443, or may choose to terminate SSL at your load balancer and then have HTTP traffic directly to your devices. So there's a lot of considerations there. And then this also will become a possible weak link or bottleneck point. Because if you have requirements that you're not only terminating SSL at the load balancer, but now your traffic between your load balancer and your Jamf Pro servers need to be encrypted. Another consideration for our traffic here is we're going to want to have the IP address of the originating device, not the load balancer. So it enables something that's referred to as X-forward, enabled within that load balancer. So determining what load balancer and how that's set up is going to be very, very important in this consideration, because now if you have to have that encrypted traffic terminating at the load balancer, and in order to enable X-forward, some load balancers need to decrypt that traffic, and then if you have a requirement of having secure or encrypted traffic between the load balancer and the JSS, it has to re-encrypt. So you have an activity now going on your load balancer where you're unencrypting that traffic and re-encrypting it. It's a lot of overhead on that load balancer. So another consideration for you outside of the JSS. Yes, sir?
A couple things to add on that. We talked about the grants in MySQL. You see in the documentation it says, username at localhost. Don't use localhost, because who's localhost? Well, I'm localhost, right? So when you're doing the grants from MySQL, always use the IP address or FQDN. And sometimes, depending on your network and how your DNS works internally, you might need to use IP, or you might need to use FQDN. But don't use just the host name and assume it's going to fill in the rest of the domain. That never works. Secondly, with the certificate, there's a number of ways how we could do that. It could be a wildcard cert. Or you could go through the whole CSR process or private key whatever process to get a bespoke cert. One thing I really love to do is to take the management URL of your JSS and set that as the common name in the certificate. And then, if your CA supports this, use subject alternate names, SANs, for every other name for anything else you're going to use. If you've got a cert, if you need to use 8443 all the way through, set the host names of each server in here as a SAN inside the cert. Maybe also toss in your file share distribution point, host names, and so on and so on. So you've got one cert to rev, one bill to pay. And yeah, your command line and key tool might be a page long, but better doing it that way than having like 12 certs to all worry about managing.
Very important. So as we think about the load balancer in terms of, what does Jamf require of that, there's really only two considerations. Number one is persistence, which sometimes is referred to as sticky. So what we want to make sure is that our transactions are going to the same server. This becomes really important when you're thinking about, let's say, user-initiated enrollment or anything that's self-service oriented. The other thing to consider is, as I mentioned before, getting the originating IP address of your client as opposed to the load balancer, and that's referred to X-forward. So those are things to really consider with your load balancing team. So we're coming back to workflow-oriented questions again. We're thinking about the impact on our servers. So talking about spreading out inventory updates, how often are we doing inventory updates? So if you have a reoccurring inventory update policy, let's say every day you're collecting inventory update, which is great, but you also have 50 policies that are also updating inventory at the end of those policies. We're going to really want to be thinking about the impact that has in the server and the database. A really important concept here, which is really kind of talked about in our second and third points here, which is considerations of advanced searches versus smart groups. We kind of easily get lulled into some workflows that maybe aren't always as optimal as what we'd like, and when we're talking about scaling, can expose some of those things. So, a smart group is really dedicated for taking action on that criteria-based search. So we create a smart group either because we need to use that notification functionality, or we're going to use that as a scoping mechanism to a policy or configuration profile. Anything else can be much more effectively handled in terms of advanced searches. So this is a really important consideration as you're doing your planning. Also, considering how many criteria you're using in your smart group. So if you, really came up with some sophisticated smart groups because, you were working late one night and it was really taken with your own brilliance, and now you have 25 criteria in your smart group because you just thought that was brilliant. We actually see now where we have smart groups that exceed 20 criteria that not so happy things happen those scenarios. So we really want to talk about, the fundamental concept, which is, something that your Jumpstart engineer or technician probably made as a fundamental concept, which is, what's the simplest way to get there?
One thing to add in that, back to the advanced search versus smart group concept. Smart groups are always recalculated. Every time a computer submits inventory, the smart groups get recalculated. The group membership gets updated constantly for smart groups. As opposed to an advanced search, which is only executed when you click go, like view in the JSS. Sorry, Jamf Pro. I'm going to be poor by the time I'm done this week. So the overhead in memory of what that means is huge, and definitely when you start talking about dozens of thousands of devices, you can imagine what that would mean. Now, as far as running those recons, there's a few things to keep in mind as far as what that actually means directly on the disk. So here's an example of a workflow I was on site, and there was every 15 trigger on an inventory update that just had been ignored. It was under the uncategorized part in the policies down at the bottom, and it had kind of been swept under the carpet and forgotten about. You can see how there's a timestamp as we're looking at the disk utilization of a particular path, and we're seeing that the database, that one table is growing by a megabyte roughly every minute. Let that sink in. By the time we were coming to this, we're seeing the database, it was about 20 gigabytes a certain problem with this one particular table. So keep in mind, if you run your inventory updates too frequently, this is going to be a real life problem that you're probably going to encounter. So at that point, consider, does every policy need to have an inventory update? Could you have a once daily, once weekly kind of catch up with everything, and could that be enough for your workflows? Like if you're driving a sports car, you can move really fast and you can do a lot of things really, really quickly. But if you're driving a semi-truck, you need to plan ahead and think about what the ramifications are in 100 yards.
Kind of related to that, we're talking with Brent here, who's kind enough to share with us his own personal work environment. Important thing just related to what Doug was talking about is, a lot of those policies that happen that, if you have multiple policies that are constantly doing inventory updates on top of everything else, frequently that will happen because you have multiple administrators in your environment. So one of the things that you might want to take in consideration if you haven't already is to have some sort of overall view of your Jamf server, right? So if you have multiple admins creating policies and you're creating it from that more granular standpoint, you need to have a review from a higher level at some point as well. Okay, now that we've done all this, how many policies that we have updating inventory, and from a more 10,000 foot view, do we really need all this stuff? Because this is how we arrive at this point, right? We didn't just out of the box create 150 policies and now all of a sudden most of them are updating inventory. It kind of grows over time. So important consideration.
So a couple things next. When coming to scripting, there's a few tips and tricks you can toss in to really maximize the total amount of processing and computing you can do with minimizing how much brain power you as an admin need to actually sink into this. You can think of that as making a generalized tool to do a generalized kind of task, as opposed to writing a specific tool to do a specific task. So with policies, for example, parameters are your best friend. If you took the CCA, CCT, you probably encountered them, but that may have gotten tucked away in the corners of your brain and not really done too much with it, since if you're dealing with computers at scale, policies are absolutely something, or parameters in your scripts is something you need to start factoring in. For example, I was working on a project where we needed to bring pop-ups to the user to give notifications at certain points. Jamf Helper was the obvious choice because it's installed by default when a machine's enrolled. And with Jamf Helper, I can pass in the name of the icon, the name of the description up top, what the button says, how long it's up for before it disappears automatically, and all those sorts of things. If I had 20 different notifications, it would be silly of me to write 20 different versions of the same script. Instead, I just wrote a generalized script where each of those values was a parameter, labeled them as such inside the web interface, And then each time I called the policy, just pass them in and tack that on to the actions the rest in the script. Related to that with extension attributes. When you think about scale, it's not just the processing inside the Jamf Pro suite of servers. Think about also what that means on each endpoint. If you're collecting a lot of information about various parts of the computer, think about how long each recon could take. You do is sudo jamf recon, hit enter, count in your head how long that takes, and maximize that out for each time it's going to run inventory. So think about all the policies running inventory. Is it every 15 minutes is it doing something like that? The thing you can really do to maximize that is have every week or something, if you need to figure out a dynamic rolling value, have a script every week run that, save it to a local preference file. At that point, you can just have, like in the green value here, defaults read to your custom plist, reading your custom value, report that back in. That takes a split second. That's not much at all. If you're looking at the slides later on or remotely from the recording, the backslash at the end of the first line, that's just a visual cue to use the admin to ignore the carriage return. So if you copy and paste it out, it'll still run. This is all one line. So if you're running it all in one line, do not put the backslash in there.
All right, so now we're seeing a little bit more sophisticated clustered setup here, we're referring to as a distributed clustered setup. And the fundamental concept here is now not only are we breaking out multiple instances of the Jamf server for talking to our clients, but also we're thinking about the function of those clients as well. So in this particular environment, we see that we have 4 instances of a Jamf server. We have got 2 child instances that are handling our client traffic behind a load balancer. Then off to the side here, we've broken up the the master web. So when we set up or enable clustering in the admin console, well, one of the things that we're doing is we're enabling which of the web instances is going to be a master. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. But the master has special roles to play, and so by breaking that out from our client traffic, we're freeing that master to be able to do just those functions. Additionally, here we've broken out a separate instance of the web app simply to handle our management console. So if you're part of let's say a large Jamf management team where maybe you have multiple admins around the globe potentially, having that function off to the side so you're not also drawing resources for other functions can have value to you. And again, just related to certificate, what Doug just described in terms of having all those alternate or subnames can really pan out in this type of environment as well, because you have one certificate that you can use for all of these functions. So anyhow, a couple considerations here within the management console. Obviously, we're enabling clustering, determining which is going to be the web app, and then again, setting up our IP valve, which determines the schema and the way that we're going to be communicating with the load balancer. So one of the important things for us to think about now is what are the roles of the master web app as opposed to the child instances. So as we talked about before, each instance or each server that's going to be running the web app needs to have a separate grant to the database. As Doug mentioned, we're going to want to either use the IP address or the server name for the instance as opposed to the local host, and also recommended a separate username and password, what might be an excellent security concern. The master web app is going to be the one that controls the database schema. So when you're upgrading from one version to another, the master is what's going to update the database. So important considerations when you're updating a clustered instance. You're going to stop all the other versions of Tomcat, upgrade the master first, and the master is going to then come online and update the database schema.
And wait for the master to be done. You're looking at the login page before you even think about starting Tomcat on the others in the cluster.
Very important. Also, when you're first setting up a clustered environment, it's important that all of your other instances of Tomcat are stopped, and the master is the first one going into your JSS and turning on clustering and setting that as the master. If you don't do that, irregardless, your other instance of the web app will always try to make the attempt to control the database schema as well. So a few other things that the master is doing. Master is doing a very, as you'll notice here, the theme here is everything that's time-oriented or scheduled. So our log flushing will be controlled by the master. Any smart group calculations that involve date and time. Very important. So as your clients are checking into other web apps, if we have other criteria, it's going to be done at that particular web app that the client is checking in. But anything associated with date and time, those smart group calculations happen off of the master. And of course, it's based on what the date and time is of that master web app. Important for you folks that have very large environments where across many time zones or even globally where that master lives is going to control when those things are happening. All right, so that may have an impact on you. Scheduled MDM commands. So when we think about things like our updates, which happens over MDM for our iOS devices, our mobile devices, that's all happened from the master web app. Also, anything that goes into a overflow queue will be executed by the master web app. So what I mean by that is if we have an MDM command that's being issued from a particular child web server that fails for some reason, and there are a lot of reasons why it can fail, and now it goes into queue for another attempt, that will be executed from the master web app. Excuse me. Our VPP license monitor and our DEP monitor, volume purchasing program, as well as device enrollment, all are functions of the master web app, and those happens on scheduled times. Our App Store updates, if you're taking advantage of that, is managed through the master web app. And then also our new functionality, which is patch. As far as going out to Jamf, to get that information, that is a scheduled function that happens from the master web app. Now, clients checking in to determine patch updates, that happens on that child instance.
And that's most of what's been true for Jamf Pro, I almost got it, for many, many years. But there's now a new feature that's come out in 993 that we're now seeing more information about in 996. That's something called Memcache. So previously, the only connection that we saw between different child nodes in the database of the Tomcat servers was through the database. If you look inside the clustering settings, the default setting is a 60-second disconnect. So if I make a change in the admin console web application that saves down to the database, it would take a minute or so for the other child nodes to check in and read that change. That's an inherent change in how the performance of your Jamf Pro works when you're dealing with the cluster. Memcache, I love the design here, the logo. These little gremlin guys, they're super cool. What their purpose is to provide a fast buffer pool of read-write content for those recent transactions in between that minute change. So for things like MDM queuing, this can be a very important and very performant element to consider. So it comes down to two configuration files. There's a couple Jamf Nation articles. If you just search Jamf Nation for Memcache, you'll pop right up. You can have several. We recommend at least two, just in case one happens to go boom. You'll have a second one around. And this is you can't scale this vertically. That documentation is not super clear. It's simpler to stand up another Memcache as stock and have 3, 4, 5 of them, and that pool kind of expands. You can think of this kind of like a fusion drive in your iMac or your Mac Pro, where you get the flash storage before it goes to spinning platter. Same kind of hierarchy. And with that, that's the base of our information. Kyle, how are we on time?
We got time for one question.
Okay.
All right, we have time for one question from Twitter here. The question that came in was, what sort of MySQL tuning is needed for scaling up larger deployments, such as cache query or memory allocations?
That definitely falls into the it depends fact as well. Namely, when you come down to many, many thousands of devices, there's a lot of tuning you can do inside MySQL. And you may have heard there's two general categories within MySQL. There's the MySAM database engine type, and then there's InnoDB is a different type. That could be a whole other discussion on what and how to talk about that part. The general answer is, if you're starting with many, many thousands of devices, talk to your Jamf buddy in support. They can help tune out those sorts of settings with buffer size, and that depends upon the core servers, how many devices you have, what the check-ins are. It comes down to just tuning it. So if you have a DBA on staff, let's get them looped in with your Jamf buddy and come down to those specifics on a case-by-case nature. But things we do tend to see, there's key buffer size is one of them. That is generally the amount of memory that MySQL takes up. Max connections, of course, is tied to, like, CGA stuff is definitely tied into this. So if you're interested in this topic, definitely recommend taking the CGA, and they'll talk about certain settings of those straight off. Cool. Thanks, everybody.